So the great thing about working with these photopolymer plates is that you can do a drawing on just about any type of transparency or even print transparency off your inkjet and utilize that as your image for your plate. So this is a drawing that I did on a clear acetate. I utilized opaque markers. The red is a pen that's designed specifically for photographic processes, and then the black is Sharpie. And I scanned it into my computer utilizing my scanner, and I scanned it in. What's great about it being on a clear acetate is that I drew it right reading and I scanned it in wrong reading. Once in Photoshop, I made some adjustments to the background. I was thinking a lot with the background about the size of the line that was there and whether or not it was really going to expose very well on the solar plate. So I made some adjustments, and then I used the invert tool and I inverted the image because you need a negative. So in this sense, it's just like any other type of relief printing. Here, what you see as white is going to be the part of the emulsion on the plate that hardens, and what is black is going to be the part of the emulsion that softens and is removed. The way that the emulsion is removed is through a washout process. So the water needs to be about 78 degrees. If it's too hot or too cold, it's not going to work correctly. So you'll see that I have the setup for the exposing of the plate. What I have is on the bottom is a piece of backing board, and then you have a piece of foam, and that foam came with the plate actually, the solar plate, and then the transparency and glass. And so you see that my transparency is smaller than the plate, so that when I put the setup all together, I can clamp it with those clamps, and the clamps will not be within the image area because they're going to block sunlight, which you can see there on the plate itself. So I'm going to remove the glass and the transparency, and now I can look at the plate and I can see that I had good contact, which is really important, which is why I use the clamps, and also that I had a good exposing time because I can see my image in my plate. So now I'm going to go ahead and take the plate and I'm going to put it into the water and begin the developing of the plate. I have to stress, I know that I don't have gloves on, but you really should have gloves on. It's just that my box, which I thought still had some gloves in, didn't. My plate was already exposed and I wanted to continue with the process. So I put it into the water, and for about the first 30 seconds, what you saw was me just agitating the water and letting the water move over the plate to soften the emulsion. Now I'm going to use this brush, and people use different types of brushes, but I really like this brush. It works really well. And I'm going to use that to further agitate the emulsion. You can see that the water changed color. That's the emulsion coming off the plate. And so I know that everything is working quite well. The instructions that I first got with this said, you only needed to do this process for a minute. And I have found that that's not true, that you need to keep scrubbing and developing the plate as long as it takes to remove all the emulsion that you need to be removed from the plate. So here you can actually see the emulsion has been removed in the non-image areas. You can feel it, you can feel the difference. And remember, you're printing a relief plate, so you need to actually have that difference in surface height so that the areas that aren't image areas will not print during the process. So if you feel that you don't have enough emulsion removed, you can place it back into the water and continue to develop the plate. You must remove all the emulsion that you need to at this point, because once the plate has been post-exposed, you can't put it back in for further developing. So if you notice that the emulsion isn't removing properly, then you can keep it in the water and keep agitating it for as long as it takes. If you can't remove the emulsion, then you probably didn't have a good exposing time and your plate may not be able to come up the way you want it to. So once you take it out the water, make sure that it has fully been developed properly. If you notice emulsion that hasn't been removed, then put it back into the water and try to remove that emulsion. Once everything is right, then the next step is to blot the plate. So I like to use the foam book. You're going to blot the plate 3 times, and this is going to remove any of the excess emulsion that may still be on the surface of the plate. So as you're doing this, make sure that you're applying enough pressure to remove that emulsion. And if there's a lot of emulsion left and the plate is very, very tacky, then you may have to put it back into the developing tray and develop it a bit more. Post-exposure will remove some of that tack, but If there's a lot of emulsion and it's really, really soft, then there could that may be an indication too of exposing times may not have been correct. Once it's all blotted and you're comfortable with moving ahead, you're going to post-expose. My post-exposure time is the same amount of time as my original exposing time, so in this case it's going to be 40 minutes. Make sure it has the same type of sun. If it had direct sun before, give it direct sun now. Watch out for things like that pine needle up there that's laying on the plate because that can affect your post-exposure, so I moved it right after the picture. So now we're going to proof the plate. I'm going to proof my plate utilizing a hard durometer brayer. So I'm going to take a ribbon of ink and lay it out on my slab, and I'm going to roll that ribbon of ink out onto my brayer. Now the hard durometer is important because if your brayer is too soft, then it's going to reach down into those areas that you want to remain white and deposit ink in them. So the hard brayer really helps to avoid that. So I'm going to ink up the plate, and I'm not applying a lot of pressure again because I want to keep the ink just on the surface. I don't want it to go into any of my recesses. And I'm going to charge my brayer as needed so that I get a nice even ink film on the plate. Now, what's nice about this is you can see like I'm able to avoid areas with the brayer that I definitely want no ink in. So, when you go to ink up any type of block or plate, analyze what you're doing and think about the way you want to deposit the ink and the way you want to roll out your plate or your block. In litho, you think very hard about the way that you want to roll your stone or your plate up, and it can really affect the process. So think with this relief plate the same way. I've noticed that there's a small part on the plate that I want to remove. I'm going to use a U-gouge, and I'm just going to remove that piece of emulsion from the plate. So these plates still have some softness to them, so you can actually carve them. If you make a plate and it doesn't work correctly after you've exposed it and developed it, you can carve that plate and get a result still. So I'm going to proof this plate onto a piece of newsprint, and I'm going to proof it just printing it with a wooden spoon. You can do wonderful prints with wooden spoons or wooden spatulas, doorknobs, barons. I've printed 8-foot plywood prints with wooden spoons. It takes a lot, but you can do it. So I'm applying pressure onto the back of the paper, and I'm going in circles, and I'm not digging in with the spoon because if you dig in with the spoon's tip, for instance, then you may actually push down into the recess that you've created and remove some of that ink. So I'm just proofing this on a silkscreen print that I had floating around. So I thought, hey, that may be nice to print it on yellow and see what I've got. So I'm just going to keep applying pressure until I'm pulling enough ink off of that plate or transferring enough ink off of that plate onto that paper to create a good proof. With something like newsprint, you'll actually see an embossment come through as you're printing this way. So that's a good way to tell how much pressure you're putting down. So there's the print on the yellow silkscreen. It looks pretty full. It's not 100% full, but it's okay. So now I can make adjustments to the plate. You never want to make adjustments to your plate until you've proofed it because you don't really know what's there until you've actually pulled an impression and evaluated that impression. So the best way to trim these plates is with a paper cutter, but I don't have one of those right now, so I'm just going to use scissors and they work just as well. So my transparency actually burnt a little bit of a line into the plate that I can cut right along. And so if that wasn't there, I would score the plate or I would create a line on that plate with a marker or something. So I'm just going to trim the plate. Now, you're making a really sharp edge when you trim that plate because you're cutting up this metal. To remove that, the sharpness, you're going to file the plate. You're going to file it from the front. Don't damage the emulsion when you do this. Don't try to bevel the plate, but you can just very carefully with a fine file remove the burrs and some of the jagged metal that may be left over after cutting it. That metal's not there so much when you use a paper cutter, but it's still a good idea to just try to remove some of the burrs and the jaggedness of the metal so that you don't cut yourself. Or even if you're using a really fine paper, you could damage the paper as well. So you're going to trim the plate after you've proofed it once to make sure that it's the impression is good. So I made changes to my plate, so now I'm going to proof it up again. So this time when I proof it, I'm pretty certain that the image area is printing well. The biggest changes I made were to the parts of the plate that I removed. So I'm going to switch now and proof it on a different type of paper. So a lot of printers will tell you everything always prints really well in newsprint. It's when you switch to a different paper, then you're really going to be able to look at the print. So I'm going to utilize a piece of scrap cotton rag paper. It's Reeves BFK, and this paper is going to be different from the newsprint in a number of ways. First, it's going to be different because it's a cold press paper versus the newsprint, which is hot press. So the hot press papers are very, very smooth. Cold press papers have a texture to them or tooth. So it's not only going to have a texture, it's also thicker. So the GSM of the paper is a different thickness from the newsprint. So that's going to also change the way that the print transfers to the paper. So you'll notice that I'm picking up the paper and looking at the proof as I'm making it. This is something that you can do that's fine. Just make sure that you're holding down the paper in another area to make sure that you don't move it. If you move the image and the paper lays down, you're not going to have an image that lines up. So you can create a misregistered image, and then you can't really tell how that image is going to be printing. So I'm just going to keep doing this, same type of thing as before, in circles, applying the pressure and trying to make sure that I'm getting a nice even amount of pressure across the entire plate during the printing process. So everything looks like it's pretty good. Just a couple areas to apply more pressure to, and there's the proof. So I noticed there were just a few other little things left after I trimmed the plate that I wanted to remove down here in the stripes in the blouse. So again, I'm going to use that U-gouge, and I'm going to just remove the emulsion. Once I've removed the emulsion, before I would go on to make any other prints, or if I was, ready to start editioning, which I'm not, but if I was, I would still stop and pull the proof at this point, since I've made adjustments to the plate. Once those adjustments are made, I'll assess the proof that I pull, and then I can decide whether or not I need to make further adjustments, or if the plate would be ready to go on to whatever the next step would be, whether it be editioning or printing on top of other runs that I've produced. One last thing that I wanted to mention was that I showed you the transparency that I made originally for the plate. This transparency actually would have been something that I could make a plate from. Because I was working with a relief block, it was easier for me to make the transparency this way and then to scan it in and create the negative. But everything on this transparency would have blocked ultraviolet light, and I could have made the plate just with this transparency itself. So, any type of drawing that you make on a transparency can also be your image source for your plate. For this plate, I utilized Photoshop to create my negative, and then I produced an inkjet transparency on a waterproof transparency film.